Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We are going to get started in just a moment. We just want to give a second for everyone to join the session. Looks like we have a couple more folks. All right, everyone. It looks like folks are getting logged in. Thank you all. Well, to everyone who's joining us, we have just a few announcements while folks are getting logged in. So I just want to let you know that recordings of this session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers any questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A area in the Whova screen on your right. The chat window is where you can engage with other attendees, and Q&A is where our moderator, Emily, will be looking for any questions that you have for our speakers. We kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentation and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones on. It looks like we're getting ready to get started, so I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to our speakers to begin. Emily, go ahead and take it away. Emily, you all set? If you want to unmute and turn your camera on. We are unable to hear you right now. There you go.
Oh, hi, everyone. Welcome to the special session, Interrelationships Between Invasive Plants and Fire Management. And our first talk will be Invasive Plants and Wildland Fire, special session, introduction and overview.
Great. Greetings, everyone, and just want to double check that my screen is sharing and that you can hear me.
Yeah, it looks and sounds great. Thank you, Stas.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So first, my name is Stas Burgiel, and I'm the Executive Director for the National Invasive Species Council, which is in the United States. And I'm going to be giving sort of a brief introduction to this special session, which is focused on invasive plants and wildland fire. Before doing that, I'd like to provide special thanks, particularly to the Association for Fire Ecology for letting us sort of host this special session, as well as to Matt Brooks with the U.S. Geological Survey for doing the legwork in terms of pulling the speakers together. So as I mentioned, I'm going to just provide sort of a brief overview on the issue and an introduction to the special session, and also provide a little bit of background and thoughts in terms of why this information and the contents of the presentations are of use, particularly to my organization, and I think some use in terms of moving forward on this issue. So, I'm sure we're all familiar with particularly in the US, with the role of wildfire in the news of late, particularly the last two fire seasons for 2020 and 2021. And while a lot of that attention has focused out west, we're going to focus on one particular aspect, which is the role of invasive species and more particularly invasive plants. And that's their role in exacerbating these wildfires, as well as how those wildfires are exacerbating the issues of invasive plants. Now, I mentioned the context of my work, that the National Invasive Species Council in the US is composed of 12 federal departments and 4 White House offices. And we work across, at a leadership level across those departments on interagency issues. And in this sense, we've also partnered with the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, which is an analog to NISC, the National Invasive Species Council, which focuses on wildland fire issues. And WIFLC, the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, also brings in state, local, and tribal governments. And so over the past 2+ years, we've really been focused on this issue. And I'll discuss a little bit how we think some of the research and the content of the presentations that we're going to see over the next couple of days can underpin and help the work that we're doing and move that forward. So as a very brief background, and we're all familiar that wildland fire and natural fire cycles are an historic component of many ecosystems. But what we're finding is that invasive species and climate change are really exacerbating issues with regards to the timing, the frequency, and the severity of those fires. And if we take sort of one generic example of invasive grasses, We see that they have the potential to increase the available fuel in ecosystems with different fuel properties. They can increase the fire size by creating both horizontal and vertical fuel continuity. They have the potential to increase fire intensity from larger fuel loads, as well as fire frequency with faster post-fire recovery. Now, those dynamics might shift according to the landscape, according to the species, but these are the kinds of dynamics that we're paying attention to and we're going to look at over the next several sessions. Now, this issue is national in scope. A lot of attention is certainly focused out on fires in the West, but as you'll see with the range of presentations we have, it is certainly predominant throughout the US. And I recognize that we do have international participants. Recognizably from a US federal perspective, we're really focused on the US, but I think if there are opportunities, it would be useful to learn from the experiences in other countries as well. And just for some examples, we can see in the Southeast with pine savanna, issues with Kogan grass and old growth climbing fern. If we move over to southwestern deserts, we've got buffalo grass and red brome. We go to islands like Puerto Rico, as well as Hawaii. We're dealing with guinea grass and buffalo grass. And then even in sort of wetland and riparian areas like the Great Lakes, we've got common reed. And one specific note, if you look at the picture in the upper right, that's actually the controlled burn. And so in some instances, we can use prescribed fire to manage or control invasive plants. And that's also an issue that will be raised and discussed over the course of the next 2 days. And then finally, and perhaps one of the poster child for the issue of invasive plants and wildfire is the Great Basin and the interaction of both cheatgrass and as well as Medusa head with wildfire in that habitat. Now, to make matters more complicated, if you add climate change into the mix, we've got, and if we think about that, what's climate change doing today? What's it going to do in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? It adds, new pieces to the puzzle. And we could be looking at warmer winters, which might have impacts in terms of insect pests that lead to tree mortality and standing fuel, longer growing seasons for invasive plants, increased drought, which might drive vegetation on the landscape, increased carbon dioxide, which might benefit C3 plants. Invasive plants, many of those are C3 plants and how they sort of process carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. And then species range shifts, and that's both for native species as well as non-native species. And at the end of the day, this results in difficult management decisions when you're thinking about adding in invasive species and wildland fire to the mix. So what are we managing for, and do we have the tools and the knowledge to be able to get to those management goals? Now, thinking about that, we're not starting from scratch. There's been a lot of work already, some of which we'll hear about in the presentations. So focus on particular geographic regions, focus on particular species, or other particular dynamics of the problem. And so the question is, how do we bring this information together to basically move the ball forward? And one of the things that I'm interested in this aspect is the issue of coordination and cooperation. So in this diagram, we can see a number of elements, and for the purposes of this special session, we're really focusing on sort of the science and the research aspect. But that science and research aspect, we want to use that to inform the operational part, what's going on in the landscape. We can also use it to inform the policy of federal agencies, state agencies, and other partners. So, what are the policies of those organizations? How are they able to use their resources in this manner? And then obviously there's the partnerships across different jurisdictions, as well as with other non-governmental entities, and the communication across those partners, as well as with the broader public. So when we're talking, we're having the presentations, today, tomorrow, and sort of thinking about the science and the research aspects, in the back of my mind is basically how do we broaden this out and make sure that we're getting maximal impact for that information. I did want to say just a little bit about sort of the work that the National Invasive Species Council is doing with the Wildland Fire Leadership Council to provide some context for how, again, we're looking at these issues. And NISC and WIFLC formed a partnership about sort of 2 years ago. And really the goals for that are to identify goals and opportunities, to prioritize coordination, to advance efforts to leverage federal efforts across the wildland fire and invasive species communities, and to build collaboration and engagement with non-federal partners. And so we have a federal interagency task team that has been looking at the issue for 18 to 24 months. And what we've been doing with that group is trying to identify what are the key opportunities, what are the key needs for action. And we're looking at those across 6 themes. 3 of those are the various stages of engagement. There's sort of the pre-fire activities, there's the during wildfire response, as well as post-fire recovery and restoration, as well as 3 cross-cutting areas. So funding, information and data management, and research and development. And really, I think, again, sort of tying it back to the discussions over the next couple of days is how does that research part inform those other sets of actions? And so we've been working with this group and trying to prioritize those opportunities for activity. And I'm hoping that we can sort of come out of this with an understanding or sort of, how do we build the grounding for those priorities and the best available science and the best available data. So turning specifically to the 3 different sessions that are part of this broader special session, for the rest of this period, we'll be focusing just on the basic interrelationships between invasive plants and fire. So looking at how wildfire promotes invasive plants, how invasive plants exacerbate wildfires, and then the role of prescribed fire in the management of invasive plants. The second session, which will be later this afternoon, gets into those eco-regional examples. So focusing on deserts, Great Plains, the shrublands in California, as well as forests in the Northwest, the East, tropical wet forests, and northern forests. And then the final session, which is tomorrow, is trying to bring a lot of this together within a management context. I'm really sort of trying to sort of tease through some of the management and coordination issues that I've discussed. And it'll be capped at the end by a brief summary and next steps from Mike Sipko, who's the executive director for the Wildland Fire Leadership Council. Now, that's not all. We've got the added benefit of another series of talks focused on the issue of fire invasive plants and disturbance interactions, which Becky Kearns has organized, and that'll be sort of Wednesday and Thursday. And then at the end of both of these special sessions, we'll have a joint fire circle. And so while there's been a lot of information over the 3 days that you'll be absorbing along with a question and answer period, this is really the opportunity to have a dialogue across the presenters, across interested audience participants, and others about how do we move the ball forward. And one of the proposals here has been to put together, collate this information and other information into a state of the science report. And so we can discuss that on Thursday. And I'm really sort of would urge folks who are interested in this issue to participate in that discussion. And in that regard, I'd also like to thank Matt Brooks and Becky Kearns for taking the lead on that. So with that, happy to take any questions, but otherwise we can turn it over to the substantive experts and get the special session underway.
Emily, if you want to unmute and introduce our next speaker.
All right. Thank you. The next speaker is Matt Brooks, and that's the effects of fire on non-native invasive plants. I'll turn it over to Matt.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, you look great. We don't see your screen share. We just see your video.
Oh, it's probably because I didn't share it. Here we go. Okay.
Right, we're not seeing it full screen yet. If you want to hit play from beginning in the top left-hand corner. There you go. Looks good.
All right. I just want to thank Stas for setting this up really nicely for us and explaining where we're going to be going in the next couple of days with this special session. In this first presentation, my goal is to summarize some of the basic sort of fundamental ways that fires can affect plant invasions, provide a foundation for especially the bioregional talks later today to discuss how they apply with specific fire regimes and species in their regions. So basically, this might seem like common sense, but it's worth pointing out because I think this slide's really important because sometimes when managers or others might be thinking about how a particular action or policy or strategy might affect plant invasions associated with fire management, there may not be good examples for that particular situation or theme. By considering these basic fundamentals, I think that you can always evaluate the potential for anything really related to plant propagule availability of invasive species and plant resource availability for those invasive species to potentially establish and spread in a new region. Essentially, those things can also be crosswalked into the management strategies that can be applied. If plant propagules are an issue, that might be the focus of the strategy. If plant resources availability are high, perhaps after a fire, perhaps after some sort of disturbance, maybe reducing resource availability might be the management focus for that particular time frame. So these are the fundamentals that I guess if you're not going to take anything else home from this presentation, it would be this slide right here. So examples of propagule availability that promote invasions. Invasions can occur without source of propagules. Propagules can include a wide range of things like seeds, spores, vegetative material that can establish individual plants. And propagules can be dispersed by a wide range, accidentally by humans, purposely by humans, other mechanisms. And so that sort of summarizes plant propagule availability. In terms of management actions, here's an example of burning Russian thistle to kill seeds. Another common name is tumbleweed, Salsola species, to prevent their establishment, especially following disturbances. If a fire were to come through this landscape, oftentimes Russian thistle is something that establishes, especially in sandy, well-drained soils. So light levels are also a limiting resource that if you increase light levels can promote invasions. Fire can move overstory and increase light levels, providing windows of opportunities for invasions. Resilient plant species might reestablish quickly, which can suppress understory growth if fire is not too frequent and doesn't get to a point that those plants no longer have resilience to recover. This is a really big a factor where there's high cover in the first place. Things like chaparral shrublands, old stands of chaparral, especially forests where there's overstory cover. Light can be a particularly limiting factor in the understory. This is an example from a forest in California. John Keeley took this photo, shared it with me a couple years ago. And it shows cheatgrass covering a landscape 6 years after a high severity fire. That in this particular case, it was a fire out of the natural range of variation for the conifer forest to recover. And you do see a couple seedlings there, but it'll be many, many years before this forest could recover, if assuming recurrent fire doesn't occur in this landscape. Soil nutrients are also a limiting factor for plant invasions. These can include chemical nutrients, they can include water as well, but I want to focus on the chemical nutrients here, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. Fire can increase or decrease levels. Very high intensity fires can actually volatilize nutrients and leave in some cases almost sterile soils. Moderate to low severity fire or low intensity fire, I should say, is actually just the opposite. You often have nutrient flushes following those situations. It's a big factor where nutrient levels are naturally low and naturally sort of inhibit invasive species spread, places like deserts, for example. This is an example from the Mojave Desert where combustion of fuels can release nutrients. Typically, intensities are not to the point that volatilization occurs and they're lost from the system. And then wind spreading them across the landscape can result in situations where, like this is red brome across a creosote bush shrubland all throughout the interspaces. This is about 10 years post-fire in the central Mojave Desert. Now, plants vary seasonality in terms of where their carbohydrate reserves are, in particular, whether they're above ground and subject to loss to the plant. If the above ground biomass is consumed by fire, consumed by herbivores, removed by mechanical fuel treatments. And so fire, for example, that occurs in this case with tamarisk or salt cedar, which is a non-native invasive species in the Southwest, especially riparian areas. Tamarisk is particularly susceptible to fire, kill by fire, if it occurs during a period of time when during the growing season when the carbohydrates are above ground. It still is a vigorous resprouter, but you can get higher rates of mortality if you time the burning correctly to when more of the carbohydrates are above ground versus below ground. These are just some data from a publication that was done a little while ago that shows that the mortality rates during the summer burn in this particular case were upwards of 80%. Fall burn were about 40%, and the control. This is associated with some biocontrol, which I'll show you in a minute too, were about 20%. This is the biocontrol. This is also relating to initial conditions. If a plant, in this case, where a biocontrol agent, this beetle, over the course of a month can take a tamarisk from this to this. This is about 80 to 85% defoliation. The beetle eating those carbohydrate reserves, pushing more reserves up to basically to deal with the herbivory. And then when you then burn these landscapes with these defoliated plants, you get higher mortality rates. So you're kind of mimicking seasonality here by herbivory and pushing the carbohydrate reserves up into the stems, where then when you burn this, you go from a mortality rate of more like 30% burned here to upwards of 80% when this is burned here. Now, the effects of a single fire can actually be really long lasting in landscapes where the resilience of the native vegetation is low. And this is a real important concept, resilience of native vegetation, because if you have the native vegetation reestablishing quickly following fire, utilizing resources that would otherwise be available to invasives, perhaps creating overstory to shade out the soil surface, suppressing invasives, then the window of opportunity for the invaders to invade and establish and spread is not as great as opposed to a situation like this. This is black brush from the ecotone between the Mojave and the Colorado Plateau. And this is what it looks like uninvaded. This is a century-old stand. This is a similar stand that is invaded, largely due to disturbance from livestock grazing by red brome and Bromus tectorum cheatgrass. Here's a landscape here that was a photograph taken in 46, 7 years past the fire in this region. This is a retake of that photo in 2002, which was 63 years post-fire. And you can see that it doesn't look anything like this. The native vegetation is not recovered, the perennial vegetation. And that this is red brome across the landscape, just as it was 7 years post-fire. So the one thing to understand is that the effects of fire on plant invasions really depends on the resilience of the underlying landscape it's occurring in. Another important thing to understand is that fire is a perturbation. It's sometimes referred to as a disturbance factor. And when it's coupled with other disturbances, natural or land use related, especially nutrient-rich area, it can really create invasible landscapes. This happens to be this is a photo of Zion Canyon. It's a combination of a upper terrace floodplain. The river is down here to the left of the picture. This is an upper terrace that would flood periodically, every other decade or so. It is an area that's also burned fairly frequently as well. And it is currently very much dominated by red brome and ripgut brome, Bromus diandrus. And you can see some of the restoration efforts to try to get some native trees reestablished. So there's a lot of compounding factors that can go along with fire's ability to promote invasions, especially other natural disturbances, in this case fluvial, as well as human disturbances, which might be related to perhaps livestock overgrazing, perhaps. And in this same landscape, and a very important sort of cautionary word is related to this issue of what if you were to go here and treat this Bromus diandrus dominated landscape. This was done a little while back, and basically the following spring, the area that the Bromus diandrus, the ripgut brome, was treated and was suppressed, was invaded by Bromus tectorum. Wasn't invaded, it was there, but basically Bromus tectorum cheatgrass replaced ripgut brome as the dominant invasive species. Again, this is that landscape that has high nutrient levels. It's highly invaded, lots of propagules. So in terms of, there'll be a talk later on control methods using fire to control invasives in particular. And this is a real important thing to understand too, that when we start going into controlling things that are increase in dominance due to fire and other factors, we have to understand what's going to replace it, very likely. And it might be something that's, in this case, just as big of a fire hazard as the ripgut brome is. I should have more slides than this one, but I want to emphasize the importance of this slide. And that is that fires do not always promote invasions. In some cases, appropriate fire use in the particular context of historical fire regimes that promote resilience of a landscape can potentially suppress invasions. So this is an example. Fire use has been used for decades in Yosemite National Park to create more resilient forests, and especially related to some of the fires we have during the past decade or so in the Sierra Nevadas, the last couple of years, but also in particular in Yosemite, the 2013 rim fire, to create landscapes that won't burn as crown fires and result in that scene that I showed you earlier from the Star Fire, that photo from John Keeley, to create landscapes that, if burned, will burn as mixed severity, largely understory burns, and maintain forest canopy, and thereby reduce the chance of post-fire invasions. So this is just, I'll just say this once here because I can't really mention all the examples here in this short period of time I have, but this is a very important thing to understand, that all fires do not promote invasions. And some fires can actually help build resilient landscapes that can suppress invasions. I'll say briefly something here about fire management activities. So management activities associated with fire. In the third part of our special session, there'll be a discussion from Garrett Dickman on fire suppression activities, and then also some others about fuel management activities and their effects on invasions. But I thought I'd mention it here in terms of the context of propagule pressure and resource availability, which is the theme of my talk. Anything that increases propagules or decreases propagules, any fire management activity has the potential to either increase or decrease invasion potential. Similarly, anything that increases or reduces resource availability has the potential to affect invasion potential. Some examples that have been sort of discussed a little bit over the years: phosphate-based fire retardant can potentially fertilize landscapes. The trade-off between preventing further area burn versus some fertilization that might occur for a couple of years is an important question about which is the priority for if you were concerned about plant invasions. These are discussions that are important to have, and I just mentioned that one as an example associated with suppression tactics, because it might just be that using phosphate-based retardant has a net benefit if it's going to prevent more area from burning that might otherwise be susceptible to invasion post-fire. Here's an example of fuel break. This is one from pinyon juniper woodland. These are very common pre-fire management, fuel management, strategic actions. But as you can imagine, relatively high cover here, zero cover here. This has the potential for plant invasions. There's more light. You're reducing resource use by the native vegetation. So there's more oftentimes more nutrient-rich landscape there, as well as the potential for the equipment that came in here to remove all this stuff, and then subsequent travel by people, because you might be going, this is an easy way to get through landscapes, driving OHVs or whatever, livestock passing through here, you might get more propagular pressure. So fuel breaks do act as vectors and can act as vectors for invasion. Next two slides, I'll show an example of some data. This is from Mediterranean shrublands. This is distance from fuel break. So this is on the fuel break. And this is no fire, 1 fire, 2 fires, 3 fire or more fires in this region. And this is relative non-native cover. So basically on the fuel break with no fires has about 10% cover of non-natives, and it increases with each successive fire rate on the fuel break to about 60%. This difference actually also, it has been in this particular case with 2 and 3 or 1 and 2 fires was within 20 meters of the fuel break, still had an effect. With more fires all the way out to 40 still had a significant effect, versus 1 or 2 fires or no fires in terms of increasing non-native cover. So it increases cover on the fuel break, and then over time those species do disperse out in the landscape. So it is a factor to consider. This is that same data showing fuel break age. So this is 10 years, 10 to 30 years, and 30 plus years on the fuel break. And as time progresses on the fuel break, you can see that the non-native plant cover increased, and also that effect away from the fuel break was significant out to, well, roughly within 20 meters or so. So in this last slide here, I'm going to just summarize some of the take-home messages that I think are important to consider moving forward in this session. 1, fire can promote invasions when they increase availability of limiting resources. In some cases, they can reduce invasions by reducing them as well. Fire management activities can affect increase or decrease invasion potential if they increase or decrease availability of propagules and or resources. This is sort of this fundamental sort of touchstone that I think in terms of determining cost benefit in terms of invasive species and fire management actions, tactics, strategies, that this is the basic question in terms of the net effects related to invasive species. And then finally, again, I'll mention that it is really important to understand that fire within the context of historical, otherwise unaltered, otherwise we might call them desirable regimes, are important ecosystem processes in and of themselves that can actually suppress plant invasions by promoting resilience of the landscape. And so, last point that I think in some of our bioregional discussions, there might be some examples that we'll see moving forward in this session. And that is the end. I can take questions if I have a couple minutes here.
Yeah, there's still a few minutes for questions if anyone wants to put them in the chat.
Emily, it looks like there's a question right now for Matt in the chat from Barb. In the Sonoran Desert, we're finding some species such as Aputia are resilient to fires and do come back following invasive grass-dominated fires. The current goal is to identify those species and potentially skew management towards their success. Are there species like these in the Mojave?
Well, things like buffalo grass are spreading from the Sonoran Desert to the Mojave. Things like purple fountain grass are planted ornamentally, and they're spreading into places like Joshua Tree National Park from the surrounding community. So the big issue in the Mojave has been annual grasses and fire. The perennial grasses are different life form, especially where the monsoon hits the Mojave, and can potentially create even greater fire threat. A good example is from Saguaro National Park, where before buffalo grass was there, red brome was the fire concern relative to invasives. now red brome isn't nearly as big of a concern as buffalo grass is, for example. So I think that I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, but the other thing I will say is in evaluating new species moving to an area, I think a real good question is what's the potential for them to be ecosystem transformers versus maybe just being another non-native species that competes with natives. I think the ecosystem transformers, those that alter fire regimes where they're not already otherwise altered, are probably the ones of greater priority for concern, for greater priority for management and early detection, rapid response.
Emily, it doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in. Oh, nope, now the questions are coming in. Emily, if you want to toss Matt some of these questions.
All right, the next question. I think those questions were answered. I guess to keep on time, we'll go with the next speaker.
Awesome.
So I'll introduce our next speaker. We have Carla D'Antonio, the influence of invasive plants and fire regimes in the Western US.
Okay, can you see my screen? Okay. Great.
Yes, it looks great. Thank you, Carla.
Okay. I want to thank Matt for inviting me and my lab group to participate in this talk today and to give you an opportunity to share some of what we've learned about fire and invasive plants in the Western US. And I emphasize here some because there's a lot to know and a lot to learn. Okay, just a second, I'm having trouble advancing. Okay, in 1992, I put forward the hypothesis with Peter Vitusic that exotic grasses had the potential to transform ecosystems by changing fire regime. And this seemed like a logical thing based on the fuel characteristics of these grasses. But we actually had very little data to support this idea. And if you go back to that paper, we have a nice grass fire cycle and good ideas, but not much data. And so what really excites me is that in the last 30 years, we've had this emergence of an amazing number of new tools and types of data, including remote sensing, advanced analytics, and all sorts of publicly available on the ground data sets, and all sorts of improved statistical approaches that have led us to really accumulate a lot of evidence that invasive plant fire cycles and invader-driven ecosystem change is pretty widespread. So the goals of my talk are to link exotic fuel characteristics with fire regime characteristics, emphasizing the Western US, since that was my charge, and highlighting tools used at both local and regional scales, and including in that some data gaps where places where I think we could use a lot more information. So the culprits, as you've already heard from Matt's talk, are mostly annual grasses. At least that's the area where we have the most data. But also in the Western US, we have tamarix, this woody invader down here, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the information we have on that, and perennial grass invaders. But I would say that even though we know perennial grass invaders are pretty important in influencing fire regime, we don't have as much quantitative analysis of them. So what I'd like to do is go through the components of fire regime and make predictive statements and show some data to support alterations in each of these components of fire regime as they're influenced by invasive grasses. And I'll start with seasonality and ask the question, do exotic grasses increase fire season? And we predict that they should create an earlier fire season and potentially overall a longer fire season. And the reason for this, in this slide shows some of the tools that are used. So you can look at a greenness index here of an exotic grass stand adjacent to Chaparral in Ventura County, California. And you see that in May, the values of the different colored lines are just different years, plunge down and are very low across the summer. So we see this dramatic and consistent year-to-year decline. And it's not a live fuel moisture, but it's a greenness index. So it tells you something about phenology. And if we compare that to chaparral shrubs, you see that in fact, you see a more consistent line across the year, even though there's year-to-year variation. So this leads you to the conclusion that the phenology of the annual grass vegetation is much, much different. And we can also go locally on the ground the old-fashioned way, and these are data from my grad student, Robert Fitch, who's a co-author on this talk today, showing live fuel moisture in annual grasses in Santa Barbara County chaparral habitat plunging in May. But in native perennial grasses that are part of a restoration experiment he's doing on fuel breaks, we see this consistent higher level of live fuel moisture above the threshold that's considered important for large fires, which is the dashed line. So perennial native grasses don't plunge like that, and our typical chamise shrub that's measured by the Forest Service in green, showing consistently higher live fuel moisture. And here's an example of what you can see in these ecosystems in, say, May. This is actually late May, and there was a small fire that burned right up to the edge of the chaparral in that grass. Okay, now we see the same kinds of patterns were measured in cheatgrass dominated ecosystems in the Great Basin. Here are data showing cheatgrass fields drying out. This is water content here, much earlier than the native dominated ecosystems nearby, shown in the open circles. So then we can ask the question, does this really result in changes in fire season? And the data on this for these specific grass invaded ecosystems is a little bit more confusing, but overall, we do see an increase in fire season length across the whole US, shown in this nice recent paper here. But interestingly, if you break that apart into ecosystems dominated by lightning as an ignition source versus humans as an ignition source, you see that this increase in fire season is really only showing up in places where human ignition is the primary ignition source. And this suggests an interaction potentially between humans and exotic grasses and fire ignitions. And we get a picture about that, the relationship, if we look at this recent paper by Bethany Bradley's group here, in which they evaluated many, many different aspects of fire. I'll refer to this paper more than once. But if you look at human ignited fires in the Great Basin, you see that they tend to be earlier by about 10 days than fires in other vegetation types. They also found that humans ignited 75% of the fires in cheatgrass, but only 27% of the fires in sagebrush or pinyon juniper woodland, suggesting again the strong interaction of human ignitions with fire changing the fire season. And if we look at a graph they published, which I found a little amusing but distressing, the 4th of July is a time when there's a large percent of fires occurring, especially when cheatgrass is present. Again, supporting this interrelationship of humans, human ignitions, and grasses. So with regard to fire regime and seasonality, we do find evidence that fire season is changing, at least in some ecosystems. So moving on to fire return interval and the question, do exotic grasses promote more frequent fire? We'll again go to a prediction that, of course, they should, if they are promoting more ignition, there should be more fire, and we should see reduced fire return intervals and increased annual probabilities of fire. This is a data set from a study by Alex Seifard, who's done some amazing work, complicated statistical and geographical information system work on fires in California. And this area included a large range of ecosystem types, but she was able to divide them into the basic types shown in the right here. And what I want to draw your attention to is that even though grass-dominated ecosystems, and these are annual grasses and invasive annual grasses, occupied a pretty small proportion of the study area, it occupied a disproportionate area of the burn sites, and these are many burns over a long recent period, supporting the idea that annual grasses are burning disproportionately and supporting higher fire frequency. A data set that Jennifer Balch, Bethany Bradley, and myself were put together involved MODIS fire perimeter and USGS fire perimeter data sets from 2000 to 2009. And we asked the question, are areas dominated by cheatgrass more likely to burn and have shorter fire return intervals? And what we found was, in fact, that this was true, that the 3 different shades of gray or black here represent the 3 different data sets that we used. And you can see that regardless of the data set, the probability of fire is much higher in cheatgrass compared to all the other vegetation types. And the fire return interval, estimated fire return interval, is shown above those bars, and it too is much lower in cheatgrass sites compared to the other sites, supporting this prediction that we should see reduced fire return intervals. I want to go back to this great paper that Bethany's group put together using MODIS fire data from 2000 to 2014. And what I really like about this is that they also were able to use all the publicly available data sets with on-the-ground transect information from 16 different sources. And these represented almost 9,000 MODIS pixels. And across these pixels, they found pixels with cheatgrass were 4.5 times more likely to have more than one fire than pixels lacking cheatgrass. So with regard to fire return interval, we have a lot of good evidence now supported quantitatively that invasive grasses in particular are changing fire return interval. Now, with regard to the size and continuity of fires, we can make predictions that exotic fuels should promote larger and more continuous fires. But is this, in fact, what we see? So going back to this study that Jennifer Balch led, we found that of the 50 largest fires in the data set, 39 were in cheatgrass vegetation, even though cheatgrass only represented 6% of the vegetation in this entire region. So that suggests a disproportionate representation of cheatgrass as a fuel to fuel large fires. But with the MODIS dataset, you also get start points of fires, and you can follow fires over multiple days. So we could ask the question, does a fire that burns into one vegetation type start in a different type? And we found 471 multiple day fires in the data set, 92 of them entirely within cheatgrass. Now, what's impressive is not that cheatgrass makes up that these cheatgrass fires are 20% of the multi-day fires, but rather that of the fires with multiple vegetation types, 65% of them started in cheat, remembering that cheat is only making up 6% of the landscape. So it seems to be support for the idea that fires start in these grasses and spread into other vegetation types. So these grasses are a threat to these otherwise intact stands. I want to shift gears a little and talk about tamarix here. And this is work by a former PhD student in my lab, Gail Drews, and it was collaborative with Tom Dudley and Matt Brooks. And what Gail was interested in is whether or not tamarix acts as a barrier or a conduit to the spread of fire. So she categorized fires, you see all the little dots here are fires in the southwestern US, as to whether or not when they encountered a riparian zone, they either stopped at the edge or they burned up and across through it. So they were either barrier fires or conduit fires. And what she found was a roughly equal number of barrier and conduit fires, but when tamarix was present, you had much higher probability of having conduit fires, suggesting that the accumulation of fuels in tamarix are creating continuity that will spread more fire into these ecosystems and change the function of riparian zones. I want to jump, before I end the discussion about area of fire, I want to jump back to this paper by Alex Seifard. Now, she had all these different vegetation types on the x-axis shown here. And these, the list of different colored little squares there are all the different factors considered in a big statistical analysis as to what was important in predicting the occurrence and size of these fires. And you see that grass, annual grass here, the little square in the bottom, is really, it's important, or it wouldn't be on the graph, but it's most important in the Southern California mountains, some of those chaparral type habitats, shrubland habitats, and also a little bit in the Sierra Nevada ecosystems. But lots of other things contribute to fire size. And so this says that large fires can be fueled and are associated oftentimes with these grasses, but there's also many other things that help predict the size of fires on the landscape. Okay, so then moving on to intensity and severity, we can ask the question, do exotic grasses change fire severity? And here it really depends on what the native vegetation is and what is being replaced. So in the Great Basin, where so much attention has gone to the effects of cheatgrass on fire occurrence and size, there's actually been relatively little attention to changes in intensity. And this is also true in California, but I want to use some data that my co-author Shane DeWeese put together on chaparral biomass that should convince you that there's going to be a change in fire intensity with invasion and conversion from chaparral to grass. So if you look at chaparral biomass, this is a very dense growing vegetation type with 3 to 5 meter tall shrubs oftentimes that accumulate quite a bit of biomass compared to, say, grassland. Now, these data on grassland biomass are not from the same sites, but they're just pulled together from across California. And a change in a big biomass change should result in a fire intensity change. And if we look at fire intensity measurements from a burn instrumented by Dennis Odian many years ago in Santa Barbara County, we see temperatures reaching like 900 to 1,000 degrees at the soil surface in a chaparral controlled burn, compared to recent data from a colleague of mine, Frank Davis, in exotic annual grassland in that same part of Santa Barbara County. And we see that the temperatures are much, much lower. So why is this important? Well, chaparral is a high intensity fire regime type of vegetation. And high intensity fire kills the seeds of exotic species and stimulates the germination of obligate seeding species that rely on fire. So it seems an essential feature of chaparral is high intensity fire. By contrast, if you have a low severity fire, you can actually see an enhanced annual grass germination. These are data from soil cores that my co-author Robert Fitch took before and after controlled burns in Santa Barbara County, where we actually see increases in emergence in the plots that achieved a lower temperature during fire, and only a decrease in grass. This is all exotic annual grass emergence here when you get to the point of having relatively high fire intensity. So a change in fire severity or intensity here is going to be in chaparral in the direction of promoting exotic annual grasses. And in fact, we know this is true because at UCSB, we have a controlled burning program on campus lands to try to reduce exotic grass dominance, in this case, Bromus diandrus. And we use supplemental fuel to actually achieve much higher temperatures to burn out that grass seed bank. And before I leave this topic, I want to mention Tamarix invasion in riparian areas again, and these are more data from Gail's work. And she did some controlled burning actually in collaboration with Matt Brooks. He showed you some of the data on mortality from that, but this is a different site. And here you see that pre-fire tamarix cover is associated with much higher combustion on the y-axis of native fuels. So the post-fire percent native trees with complete twig combustion is almost 100% when you get to high tamarix values, but at lower tamarix values, you don't see that kind of combustion. And this also correlates with mortality. She measured, these are logistic regression curves, but the data basically show that you have a much higher probability of mortality of cottonwood in those places where tamarix density at the beginning, before fire, was much higher. So this suggests in this ecosystem that invasion is enhancing intensity, and in the chaparral ecosystems, we expect a reduction in intensity. So the answer here is that it depends, and it'd be nice to sort of get a lot more data across some gradients to really understand this relationship better. So the last aspect of fire regime I want to touch on is this question of type of fire. And here I'm referring to, is this a ground fire versus a crown fire? And I'm going to really skirt that issue and just change this question to, do exotic species simply introduce an entirely new type of disturbance? And we've already heard reference made to this issue. And the answer is yes. And this is a salt desert ecosystem and some data gathered by a former postdoc of mine, looking at the occurrence of fire in these low desert ecosystems across the valley bottoms in Nevada, where fire is not a historic disturbance and the species there have no obvious adaptations to fire. And across the fires she surveyed, they converted basically from these arid shrublands to exotic bromus grassland. And the green blobs here in this picture on the left are Russian thistle which Matt made reference to already, and it's very successful at invading what used to be an atroplex desert. So the non-native species go way up and the native species go way down, and this lasts for many decades in these ecosystems. So a single fire can promote long-term conversion. So in summary, we have evidence that exotic species can affect almost every aspect of a fire regime in the Western US. And new tools that we have, such as amazing remote sensing and data analysis tools, support exotic impacts over vast areas. So we're able to move from local scale measurements to regional scale assessments. There still are data gaps though. For example, in many mesic habitats, like the forest that Matt showed a picture of, we don't have a lot of good quantitative data of the long-term role of invasive grasses there or other invasive plants like the brooms. And we also don't have as much quantitative data about perennial grass invaded systems. And I'd like to suggest that we really need to also separate out and sort out some of the complexity of causation relative to fire regime changes. And I referenced the paper by Alex Seifert again as a good example of using, in her case, structural equation models to try to sort out the complexity of causation. And I'd argue that it's important for us to do that because not only is climate and climate change affecting moisture content, biomass, fuel continuity, and thus fire regime, but humans and human ignitions and human management actions, as well as population growth and land use change, are going to interact in the future. And we need to be able to better anticipate where fires are going to occur and be ready to have strategies to manage post-fire and fire-driven change. And I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Carla. Emily, if you want to go ahead and introduce our next speaker.
Oh, sure. Our next speaker is Dr. Rima D. Lucardi. This presentation is How Invasive Plants in the Eastern and Southern Regions of the U.S. affect fire behavior and alter fire regimes. And
Unmuting myself would help. Good day, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to present at this special session of the 9th International Fire Ecology and Management Congress and the intersection with invasive plants. Here, I'd like to thank my co-authors and their contributions to this presentation and the following book chapter that is to follow. Dr. Travis Marsico, the second author, is professor and associate chair of the Department of Biological Sciences and curator of the herbarium at Arkansas State University. Third author is Elizabeth Usborne, is a non-point source water coordinator for over 10 counties along the headwaters of the Mississippi River. She serves at the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources out of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which provides us necessary management perspectives on the ground. In this talk, we primarily consider impacts on fire behavior and regimes in the eastern province of the United States by invasive plants. So some examples of non-native plants can have positive feedback fire cycles or negative feedback fire cycles. Positive meaning that they increase fire intensity or increase the type of fire, whereas negative feedback fire cycles with non-native invasive species can suppress fire events or in specific areas or detrimental to areas where we can use, manage, and prescribe fire. So there is a wide diversity of species resulting in a wide diverse of impacts on fire behavior and fire regimes. Broad negative impacts can include alterations of community structure, alterations, reductions, or harm to fauna and ecosystem services, and changes in fire behavior, regime shifts, and seasonality of fire events, along with adding complexity to utilization of fire as a management strategy. The diversity of non-native invasive plants contributes to the complexity of how and when to use fire as a management option, as well as novel or unpredictable fire behavior, temperatures, and non-native invasive plant responses. So we're interested in what their contribution may be also to wildland fires as well as prescribed fires. Each taxon represents a different story, further complicating generalizations that we can make about fire cycles. So to capture a generalizable framework, despite the complexity and diversity of non-native invasive plants in the eastern United States, we have tried to summarize a positive feedback fire by invasive cycle and a negative feedback fire by invasive cycle, where the positive is in dark orange on the left side of your screen, and the negative feedback cycle is in blue on the right side of your screen. Non-native invasive plants can impact fire and the systems in which they occur, including characteristics like pyrogenicity associated with the plant itself. This is where the invasive plant establishment in an area can result in increased fuel loads, increased fire frequency, temperature, unpredictability, and others. In the scenario of the positive feedback cycle, the non-native invasive plant is either pre-adapted or benefits from these alterations or disturbances in fire behavior, thereby increasing that species abundance, contributing to an ever-increasing and modified fire behavior and therefore regime, sometimes an area where fire is not historically part of the system, or altering the system such that ecosystem services are detrimentally impacted. However, on the right side of your screen, there are also widespread invasive plants that suppress fire by increasing soil moisture, generating wet thatch or litter, or are able to capitalize on fire events, whether managed or wildland, that lead to rapid resprouting and plant community composition shifts, often to the detriment of native flora and fauna. Bush honeysuckles are a good example of a species that has invaded wet areas throughout the East and have resulted in poor results to prescribed fire management strategies and detrimentally impacts forested communities and water quality. How do they get here, there, and everywhere? Non-native invasive plants are generally defined by some basic criteria. The major point being human-mediated transport and introduction of propagules. Hotspots of high propagule pressure by non-native plants that are not yet considered invasive to meet that criteria include international seaports in the United States. These hotspots and entry points, based on the sheer volume and the speed of trade and the supply chains associated with those, facilitate non-native plant transports from other continents and can be rapidly transported across the nation in Figure 1 here. These non-native species can readily become invasive depending on their biology, ecology, and overall propagule pressure. In Figure 2, the non-native invasive plants in forested lands from Forest Inventory and Analysis survey data indicates red areas as highly invaded based on species diversity and land cover. For example, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is one of the most invaded public land areas in the United States. And that indicates how invasible the eastern United States is and its permeability to the Gulf Coast Basin as well as the Atlantic Basin. Using the Great Smoky Mountains National Park as an example, because of its great plant diversity and highest human visitation can lead to greater opportunities for non-native invasive plant propagules to move and establish. But there are also native species that are becoming invasive in areas where they have not been found before. There are plenty of species native to the United States, but not all of them are found in the communities in which they occur at different spatial scales, depending on what you're interested in. This includes expansion from a specific ecoregion, such as Baccharis on the left-hand side of your screen here. Baccharis halimifolia has a number of common names, so I will not be using much by way of common names throughout the talk. The woody encroachment and necessary fire managed systems, such as in grasslands and prairies by eastern red cedar, also known as Juniperus virginiana, is expanding. How do I go back? There we go. And lead to what is called prairie candles by many. And this also includes the idea of climate change, where these native species are changing their ranges. And that woody encroachment can be due to warming, for example, woody encroachment in the thawing tundra in the Arctic, for example. And in Figure 1 here in the map indicates how the native range of Baccharis halimifolia is increasing inland northward and has invaded other areas of the globe. On Figure 2 here with regard to juniper and also, for example, mesquite trees, Prosopis glandulosa, those are issues that are pyrogenic species, tree species, that complicate management and the use of fire in prairie lands and grasslands. Here on the left side of the screen, we see garlic mustard, a pernicious ground covering non-native invasive plant that opportunistically colonizes and germinates after fire events from source populations or people. There are many ways that non-native plants can invade terrestrial and wetland systems, and we have summarized that here on the right. The colors of dark orange and blue are again linked to the conceptual fire cycles presented earlier, where there can be increasing fire intensity in terms of temperature and hotter fires, increasing fire height, ground fires, climbing ferns, opportunistic after fire events or disturbances, depending on your semantics, such as garlic mustard, expanding, changing, and altering the phenology of fire events, subjecting areas that are not generally adapted for fire to fire, and preventing fire in fire-adapted systems. For example, the European buckthorn that is predominant throughout the eastern United States towards the north and the Midwest. And this complicates management strategies and options overall. So in terms of increasing fire intensity, we use some prime examples. In figure 1, we see Japanese honeysuckle in a very strangling near monoculture, also providing vertical ladders towards crown fires here, seen in this figure. We have Melaleuca quinquenervia, which increases the intensification and is extremely difficult to manage, resulting in what is commonly called fires of kerosene in Florida. And Matt earlier referred to Cogan grass here in the Southeast, where where we primarily produce pinus forest products and agroforestry of the wood basket of the United States here in the southern region, due to Cogan grass invasion, can result in very altered fire regimes, such as intensification of fire temperature, unpredictability of fire behavior, as well as arrows here to indicate the fireballs that can occur with Cogan grass. Even though it's an understory plant, it can result in crown fire because of these fireballs. Another way we have alluded to changes in fire behavior and the use of fire in natural resource management include non-native invasive plants of the vine growth forms, such as Japanese honeysuckle I showed you earlier. The invasive climbing ferns, Lygodium as a genus, pictured here, you can see that it has killed the trees, but it also provides ladders for fire to reach tree crowns and result in crown fires, and further modifies fire behavior, whether it's prescribed, natural, or stochastic. And these are necessary for the system. It becomes even more complicated, thereby altering the fire regime and limiting management options if it is a fire necessary system. To summarize, the diversity of non-native invasive plants is great. The biology and ecology of each invading plant adds layers of complexity for strategies and decisions for natural resources management. It is necessary for researchers to collaborate and listen to those on the ground and on site, such as managers, about what works and what doesn't with regard to fire and the ever-increasing abundance of non-native invasive plants in the USA, or non-native plants that have not yet become invasive in the United States. These changes in fire behavior and regimes impact ecosystem services and can result in increased public health issues, such as increases in Japanese barberry invasion due to its broad escape from cultivation, results in tick mass years, and increases the likelihood of vectoring tick-borne diseases. This is a public health issue. Fires where non-native invasive plants are present can also alter smoke behavior and content, including the release of volatiles that can sometimes be poisonous depending on the species. Ultimately, it is a very complicated story. What's more, this is all happening with accelerating climate change. Global connectivity and global climate change are accelerating non-native species establishment new to the United States as well as to other continents and nations. These provide opportunities for these plants to expand their ranges. We can see that soil moisture, among many other factors, can contribute to non-native invasive plant persistence through modification and engineering of communities they invade, Phragmites australis being an excellent example of an ecosystem engineer, and the cryptic invasion by non-native lineages into the native lineage and becoming widespread and very much impacting the Great Lakes region. Climate change, therefore, can directly alter fire regimes and fire seasons. It can also influence the growth and distribution of invasive plants, and it creates further complexity for natural resource management. For example, Microstygium viminium here, otherwise known as a number of other common names, does result in the intensification of ground fire events in terms of temperature. And I think I may have ended a little bit early, but on behalf of my co-authors and myself, I thank Matt Brooks for the invitation. Thank all y'all for your attention. We wish to thank Kelly Kearns and Chris Gatsky for contributing information, data, and insights, and the indigenous tribes of the Great Lakes region under GlyphWick for proactively addressing the issue of, in this case, I won't use the word invasive, but non-native plants. And what we are looking for is what is next on the horizon and how can we prevent it. The bottom right-hand corner here, you have our email addresses, and feel free to reach out to us with additional questions. With that, I hope I have time and I will be able to take some questions. I also have my co-author, Dr. Marsico, on this session, and he will be able to also answer some questions. Thank you.
Carla, we have a question for you that was asked earlier, and since we have just a couple minutes while folks enter their questions, I'm wondering if we can go ahead and get you to unmute and turn your camera on. The question was from Mike. He said, data gaps. What can be collectively considered to reduce the gaps in data? Are there any effective tools or systems that have been successful at collecting data at scale as opposed to individual research data gathering?
Well, I have to clarify first or understand what he's asking about in terms of individual data gathering. Is he asking about going out and putting down transects and measuring plant abundance on those transects, or individual people having to sit down by themselves and gather data from multiple sources? And with regards to the latter, there are a lot of publicly available data sets now. And so I would advise looking at some of these papers that I cited and looking at where they got most of the data and where it's archived. There's a lot of different publicly available data archives now, and you have to just do some serious legwork to find those. Other things like, the MODIS and the USGS fire perimeter data are relatively easy to access. So there are a lot of big data sets out there. You have to designate your region and start your search, and really have to devote a lot of time to data mining. And there's some real masters of it out here. I'd say, the authors of some of these talks or papers I referenced, Bethany Bradley's group, Jennifer Balch's group. And in fact, Jennifer is leading an effort at CU Boulder to create a big data science center so that we can sort of harness the data revolution, which we are in the middle of right now. There's so much data out there. So looking for centers where they put these data together and, getting access to these records. And in my case, like finding students who are really willing to put in the time to find these big data sets. But if you're a person who really likes to be in the field, which is how I describe myself, and measure plants in the field, there's importance in that as well. And, those data need to be made publicly available as well, so that we can all share our information and get much broader insights as a result.
Thank you so much, Carla. Mike responded that he's simply trying to get data at scale, and thanks you. Mike and Carla, I recommend connect via the Whova app so that you can continue to share resources. And Emily, let's go ahead and introduce our last speaker for our last 20 minutes of this session.
Okay, our last speaker, the presentation is titled, How Can Fire Be Used to Manage Invasive Plants? And we'll take it away, James.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can get this going here. Okay, let me know when you can see the presentation.
Coming up, there it goes. It looks great.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much, everybody. Greetings from sleepy little Commerce, Georgia, just up the road from Athens, Georgia, where I'm headquartered with the USDA Forest Service. I want to thank my co-authors, Matt Brooks and Amy Simstad, both with U.S. Geological Survey. I imagine that many of the folks on the meeting know Matt and Amy, and I suspect that many of you don't know me, as I'm I would say, a relative newcomer to the field of invasive plants and fire. I'm an entomologist who really digs invasive, well, I don't like invasive plants. I find them interesting, and I see a lot of need for work in the South. And so a couple of years ago, I started working on some problems involving woody invasives, and I think I'm hooked. I split my time probably 50-50 between bugs and plants now. So I'm going to talk about how fire can be used to manage invasive plants. And when you look at the little puzzle on the right, we're trying to put together this puzzle of management plans for managing invasive plants with different means, including fire. And you know, when you look at wildland ecosystems, invasive plants and fire, each by itself is a complete field of study. And so this is very complex. This has been a theme in the talks this morning. We're talking about incredibly complex issues with a lot of moving parts and trying to distill that down into a 15-minute talk, which is very difficult. But this general approach on the left-hand slide here for considering fire as a component for management programs is very useful, especially since some of the drivers of fire regimes and climatic variables and so forth vary geographically. So I'll go through these real quick. The first step is to identify the main abiotic and biotic drivers of fire regimes on the landscape of interest, and to determine the range of fire regime characteristics that are possible in that area of interest. And that's going to change from place to place. It's also going to change on a local scale, depending on things like slope and aspect. Determine if there is a particular fire regime or suite of fire effects that might be useful for controlling the invasive plant of interest. Decide if other management treatments are needed for incorporation into IPM programs, and frequently that is the case. Evaluate the expected ecological effects of the management systems. This goes back to some of the things that Matt said earlier about resilience. And in general, complex ecosystems are much more resilient than simple ecosystems. That's something to keep in mind. And finally, one that sometimes we neglect, establishing follow-up monitoring and retreatment plans. And I'm not aware of any management plans that incorporate fire that are a one-shot deal. So you're generally looking at establishing a approach with repeated treatments. This graphic captures some of the complexity of this issue. This is from some work that Matt did in 2006. So you have the overarching ecosystem. Within that, you have all the abiotic and biotic effects within the ecosystem that can vary geographically. The plant community is housed within that ecosystem, of course. And you see the feedback loops there between the different plant groups. You have your target invasive species, native desirable species, and other invasive species. They all interact. They're all acted upon by the fire regime in the center, and they all provide fuels for that fire regime. Within the fire regime, these different fire characteristics, frequency and extent, are probably the most difficult to study using traditional methods, where we like to do smaller scale field experiments, block things out nicely for statistical rigor. And that kind of goes back to the question that was just asked. How do we glean better information over the broader landscape? And I think that's important. And I think I agree that there are tools now, but also a need to share more data. In any case, we're not going to spend a lot of time digging into the weeds. on fire regimes and fire characteristics. I'll mention a few specific things, but that's probably one part of this talk that's going to get short shrift just because of time restraints. So the second question, is there a fire regime that might be useful for controlling the target invasive plant? I found digging through the literature that it's probably most useful to consider fire regime in the context of invasive plant biology, which of course is very complex. So we're going to go through some different groups of plants. There's going to be a lot of generalities. There are always exceptions to every rule. So keep that in mind as we go through the talk here. We can say a few general things about invasive plant biology and fire. Plants that are generally most amenable to control using fire include annual species, excuse me, species that produce seeds well after the fire season begins so that they can be exposed to fire. Plants that have flowering structures embedded within the fuel bed so that those can be exposed to fire. And plants that have short-lived seed banks, because ultimately the goal is to reduce propagule availability with your management plan. In general, plants that are less amenable to control using fire include the perennials. They include plants that have permeating tissue that is protected from heating that occurs below ground or well above the fuel bed. Plants that resprout readily because they're adapted to fire or adapted to some other form of recurrent disturbance. And finally, ephemeral species with long-lived seeds that germinate following fire. So let's talk about annuals for a moment. In the annual grasses, the idea is to kill seeds before they shatter or kill the plant before the seeds become viable. So timing is obviously of paramount importance. But complicating that is the fact that seeds have varying susceptibility to heat. And so that needs to be considered. The example there is a prescribed burn for Medusa head. Most of you are probably familiar with Medusa head. It's an invasive winter annual grass and a pest of western rangelands. The thing with Medusa head is that seeds mature later than most annuals and remain on the plant so that they can be available and subjected to the fire after sufficient fuels have been allowed to build up. Extent is important. Burlman and others in 2016 did some work where they demonstrated that nearby infestations of Medusa head can easily reinfest areas that have been burned. So control isn't lasting, but a broader extent of prescribed fire can probably extend the effective control time. Annual forbs are similar in terms of timing. Timing is very important. The example here is yellow star thistle, and we're going to talk about that in a little more detail in a couple of case studies near the end of this discussion. Biennials are generally challenging. The illustration here is garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is present in the northeastern US with scattered infestations throughout. It has long-lived seeds, it exists under different fire regimes, and it can resprout. So fire can actually perpetuate this species. And I think Rima alluded to that in her talk. So garlic mustard is a real challenge. In general, biennials present a challenge due to the first year rosette stage where the meristems are protected. But plants that have bolted in the following year can sometimes be controlled with fire. Where fire has been attempted, repeated application, higher intensity, or subsequent herbicide application can be beneficial when you're controlling biennials. And subsequent herbicide application is actually a pretty common measure for biennials and also for woody invasive plants. Perennial grasses are frequently the target of controlled burns for changing vegetation. This particular example is smooth brome. Smooth brome is planted as a forage, but it's also very, very invasive in areas where we don't want it, which is the case with a lot of plants. It's an introduced cool season perennial with deep roots and rhizomes. So timing and soil moisture are very important for controlling smooth brome. In general, native perennials in the western US benefit from prescribed fire to control the invasive annual grasses. And in general, cool season perennial grasses in the central and midwestern US can be controlled by properly timed fire generally mid to late spring, to the benefit of desired warm season grasses. And again, this idea of timing doesn't apply across the entire US. That's going to differ according to where you are. Certainly in more northern areas, timing might be pushed forward a little bit later and that sort of thing. Perennial forbs are a big challenge. They tend to respond positively to fire, whether it's wildland fire or prescribed burning, and increase in abundance. The example here is diffuse snapweed. Diffuse snapweed is a bit of an exception because it retains its seeds a little bit longer into the season as opposed to the other knapweeds, but it shares the nasty invasive characteristics of other knapweeds, and it can quickly colonize bare soil that's left in the wake of burns. With the perennial forbs, in some cases, again, herbicide applications may follow burns to increase efficacy. Woody invasives are an area that I'm working in with a couple of different species, calorie pear and Chinese tallow, both of which are, calorie pear is a big problem in the entire eastern US, and tallow tree more so along the Gulf Coast. The majority of woody invasives don't lend themselves to control via prescribed burning, primarily because they readily resprout. The example here is a calorie pear in central Georgia, where fire has been run through this system. You can see the main stem of the plant there dead, and it's resprouting down at the base. And many woody invasives can resprout not just at the base, but they can resprout at some distance from the mother plant. So in the case of calorie pear, you can run fire through an area and wind up essentially with a much worse situation with a thicket of calorie pear instead of a few trees. So we're doing some work along with some colleagues at Clemson University to try to figure out how to work fire into overall management programs for calorie pear. So some species of shrubs are an exception. They can be controlled by repeated fire, which is necessary to deplete the seed bank. Some trees, both native and invasive, can be controlled by fire. In the case of Chinese tallow, generally it involves removal of the trees and then letting the fuel bed build up, and the young trees are killed by fire if sufficient fuel is present. And that often involves sowing grasses to build up the fuels. In closed canopy woody invasives, situations where they've grown up in closed canopy may require treatment first because they're fire suppressive, and it's very difficult to run fire through those areas where, for example, you have a monoculture of Chinese tallow or many of the shrubs as well, the invasive shrubs. So this really all comes down to propagule availability. Matt talks about propagule availability a little bit, and it's worth going through just to talk for a moment about what makes an invasive plant invasive. And a lot of it has to do with these characteristics that I've listed here. Most of our invasive species produce a lot of seeds. Many woody invasives mature very early. They can produce viable seed within the first few years of growth. The seeds of many invasive species are easily moved about. Many of the fruits are dispersed by birds and other organisms. Some produce seeds that are viable for several years. Many seeds, especially those of woody invasives, can be scarified by fire and then germinate. And programs with frequent fire that might be able to be used advantageously. But unless fire frequency is such that it kills those young plants, then you're going to wind up with as bad or worse a situation with some of the woody invasives. Vegetative reproduction is a problem, and that can change the growth form and result in thickets and trouble for equipment, people moving through areas. And again, overall, the goal is to reduce or eliminate propagules. So we'll go through a few quick case studies. Yellow star thistle is present in the eastern US, but it's a more serious problem in the West. The seeds are very persistent. In terms of timing, burning in early to midsummer tends to work. Native grasses and forbs have produced seed already at that time. And yellow star thistle seed is not yet mature, so timing is important. The plant does not need to be completely consumed by fire for mortality. Sowing grass in the years prior to burning can generate fine fuels, and overall success with burning for yellow star thistle has been pretty well documented. Melaleuca, on the other hand, represents a challenge. This is a woody invasive imported from Australia, which has multiple negative effects on the environment. It's highly fire adapted. It's highly pyrogenic. We haven't talked much about human constraints, but in the case of Melaleuca, oils in the foliage generate very thick black smoke. And of course, smoke management is a concern anywhere we apply fire. The seeds drop when stressed, including by fire. And the tree itself produces large amounts of highly flammable fuels, the bark, the leaves, and the twigs. So what happens is when you run fire through an area, you can wind up with a situation like the photograph in the slide here, which looks like a pretty dead landscape, but in fact, the vast majority of those trees will sprout, the seeds will germinate, and you'll wind up with virtually no change, or if anything, an increase in density of Melaleuca in that area following fire. Now, there is still interest in using fire to control Melaleuca, but that would require very careful timing and pretty specific local conditions. Now, this is some of Amy's work. This is our optimistic brief case study for the Northern Prairies. This was inspired by adaptive management programs. It was expanded from annual brome adaptive management, but it includes these additional plant groups circled in red. The northern mixed grass prairies where this is being applied have been invaded by all these different types of plants, and fire is generally useful in one way or another for controlling all of them. But the details, complex conditions make for complex decision making, and that's what this diagram represents. The model itself predicts how the vegetation community will respond to management inputs and other factors. So it's essentially a state and transition vegetation condition model. And what's interesting to me about this is that managers drive the process with input on their satisfaction with vegetation conditions. The managers rank those conditions, they're assigned a value, and the model predicts outcomes 2 to 3 years down the road based on inputs and distills the management actions and the outcomes and resulting happiness for the manager. Exotic forbs inject uncertainty into the model, and human constraints are based on the acceptance level of the manager. And so using Bayesian decision network built from monitoring data and structural adaptive management, they can deal with this system complexity. And I guess Amy indicated that they've been working on this for a few years, and they're optimistic that it's going to provide some real tools on the ground for managers. Don't ask me to explain it any further than that. I'm impressed, but I'm not sure I understand all of it. And of course, there's broader considerations and effects with any management program. You have to consider the effects of treatments on the entire plant community. You have to consider things like nesting birds, which have been studied quite a bit, especially in terms of invasive shrubs, which the birds become dependent on. So vegetation replacement might be a consideration. Treatments are going to have impacts on higher tropho levels. Fire has effects on ecosystem properties. Soils have been pretty well studied in this regard. Of course, if a fire is of sufficient intensity to leave bare soil behind, not only do you risk invasive plants reestablishing, but you risk things like erosion and cascading environmental impacts. And finally, we haven't talked much about human constraints. We could spend the entire afternoon talking about some of these individual components. So again, it's complicated. We brainstormed a little bit about some future research directions that might be useful. There are still emerging invasive plants that need to be studied. There are trade-offs when using fire, when multiple invasives with different fire responses are present or nearby. And another question that came up, frequency of fire needed to prevent invasion versus reduce it once it's happened. And so I think all of these deserve attention, and we could probably fill out several more bullets. There's still a lot we don't know. There's a lot we do know. I included a few references here. I hope that you got something from the talk, and appreciate the chance to speak on this today.
Thank you, everyone. I want to take a moment as we wrap up this session to thank all of our speakers and let you know that the session was recorded and will be available for you within the next week or two in the Whova app. We're going to take a 20-minute break before beginning our next set of breakout sessions at 3 p.m. Eastern. There are 6 special sessions, each featuring a great lineup of multiple speakers and topics, as well as our first of 2 virtual trips. To choose the one you'd like to join, use the agenda tab to the left of your screen and click sessions. You can also click subsessions for more details about what to expect. To join the sessions offering Spanish and Portuguese interpretation, be sure to select the session titled Wildfire Simulation under Future Climate Change, Methods and Applications. Thanks again to our speakers and enjoy the rest of your day.